Thank you, Professor Blocher. Mayor Rotering, the gun lobby often claims the best way to stop mass shooters is to have lots of people to carry guns, so bystanders can engage a mass shooter and shoot them as well. Of course, that approach is good for the gun lobby's goal of selling more guns. The New York Times recently looked at 433 active shooter attacks since the year 2000 to see how many times a bystander stopped a mass shooter. It happened 22 times out of 433 mass shootings, about 5%. 10 of those incidents, half of them, involved a bystander who happened to be a security guard or an off-duty police officer. So it can happen, though it's pretty rare statistically, and we must remember that many states have concealed carry or open carry with no requirement of training whatsoever. My question to you is this: how much can we count on a good guy with a gun to stop a mass shooter when the mass shooter has an AR-15 style assault weapon that it can empty a 30-round magazine in about as many seconds?
A good guy with a gun would have had no impact on the shooter. We have heard from hundreds of parade goers, and they all had hundreds of explanations of where the shooting had come from. They could not identify even where the shooter was, the area where this took place. There were bullets ricocheting off of walls. There was a courtyard, and we had good guys with guns on site who were trained, who got there within seconds, and it was just too hard to see where he was. We also know that these weapons and these bullets can pierce Kevlar vests. I think the fact that we had less than a minute should tell anybody who thought that a good guy with a gun would have had an impact. The only thing that would have happened would have been more chaos, more carnage. You would have had people shooting all over the place. That absolutely would have been a disaster in Highland Park.
So technically, your police and law enforcement were outgunned by this shooter in Highland Park.
They were, and literally, because it was so quick, they got there within seconds. But again, hundreds of people had hundreds of explanations. My own husband was right there. He thought the shooter had been on the street. He was right in the middle of it all. Everybody gave different stories.
Professor Blocher, you read the Bruin opinion, and I have as well. What does it say about potentially banning assault weapons or requiring official training in the weapon before you can own one?
Nothing directly. The court's very clear that it is ruling only on the legality of may issue public carry restrictions like the one that New York had in place and other populous states do as well. The court, the majority, and the concurring opinions are very clear that the Second Amendment still permits various forms of gun regulation, perhaps including those, or certainly those involving certain kinds of arms. I think that the question going forward will be about the historical analogs. In the lead up to Bruin, prohibitions on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines had been universally upheld in the federal courts. There were some lower court and panel opinions that had called them into question, all of them held pending Bruin. Now, I think the litigation will be about whether assault weapons constitute the kind of dangerous and unusual weapons, which the court in Heller and again in Bruin emphasized can be prohibited consistent with the Second Amendment. I suspect that's where most of the litigation will be, and the evidence that you're hearing today is probative on that question.
Let me stick with the inanimate object argument, which we've heard. It's just a piece of material, weaponry, plastics and steel and so forth. And I wonder how that logic applies to grenade launchers. We don't allow those to be legally sold to Americans. They are just inanimate objects. We don't allow automatic weapons to be sold to Americans, which holding the trigger continues to fire round after round after round. Could you describe whether you think there's an analogy?
I think that weapons and firearms in particular intensify violence, and generations now of research have shown us that. Dr. Hunter had spoken to this earlier, that certain kinds of gun restrictions may not lessen the number of criminal incidents, but what they do is, what weapons do is intensify the violence that's inflicted. That's the nature of the instrument. That's why some people want them for self-defense. That's why some criminals want them for criminal use. And so I think there's not much to the idea that the instrument alone is inert. Of course it is, but the question is, what happens with that instrument in various situations, whether it's being put to good use or bad.
Thank you. Senator Fines?